means that there are instances, for example, the party could assume the position of a First Minister, but not a Deputy First Minister under the current institutional arrangements. But it taps into a much broader question as well around the institutions in Northern Ireland, which is that it's very difficult to countenance changing those as part of any future forward momentum or adaptation to changes within society, because it was fundamentally designed and built on the basis of bringing together the two, effectively conflicting those predominant communities and groups within Northern Ireland, which were unionism and nationalism in 1998. And of course, if you're looking to any sort of changes that would accommodate a third element within that picture, then that implicitly is going to change the dynamics and the type of power that those two blocks could hold within the institutions going forward. So there's a whole complexity around all of that as well.
These people coming up the stairs are members of the Senate, the Upper House or Senate, and they are making their way to the Dáil now, the lower house, to join members of Parliament there, TDs as they are described in Ireland. And there we catch a glimpse of Leo Varadkar having a chat with his predecessor, Enda Kenny, the man seated just to his left. And if I'm not mistaken, that's also Mary McAleese, the former President of Ireland, two of the invited guests this afternoon. We don't see Mary McAleese that often these days, but she has written quite a bit and expressed her own concern about the impact of Brexit on this island and on Anglo-Irish relations. Having an interesting chat, it seems. And in fact, Jerry Adams has just appeared to the right of the screen, the gentleman we were just talking about a few moments ago, who I think could be fairly described as the world's most recognisable Irish Republican. The man who persuaded the Provisional IRA to embark upon a ceasefire and persuaded the Republican movement to pursue peace. And now that they've sat down, we see Bertie Ahern in the middle as well.
All there.
So all of the guests are taking their seats. Members of the Upper House have taken their seats also. We can't be, I keep saying this, I'm going to scupper it, aren't I? We can't be that far away from hearing from the President.
You said that about half an hour ago. Just in terms of Jerry Adams, as he's there in the shot, I was reminding some younger members of the team that there was a time when we weren't allowed to broadcast his utterings, and there was an actor that had to dub his voice.
Yes, indeed, and I will have to hold my hands up to this and say that was also before my living memory as well. But certainly it is one of those peculiarities that whenever you look back on history and, you hear the stories, particularly, in my case, from other generations within my family, and hear those experiences, it does sound completely and utterly bizarre, but then you have to realise that is just how severe things were at the time. It's very easy to stand here now and see the island of Ireland as it is now, and to forget what it was, what it has taken for it to become the place that it is now. And indeed, even looking within Northern Ireland specifically, it has come on such a journey. I mean, I came along very much at the tail end of the Troubles. I'm a 90s baby, so I have no living memory of the intense conflict of the 70s and 80s. But at this stage, it's a very, very different society, and a lot of what is understood and taught and discussed about not even just the Good Friday Agreement, but the Troubles that preceded it, really emphasise that there is a very complex history there, but one that is also can be easily forgotten. So there's an important element there, not of romanticising or glorifying the past, but ensuring that there is a link between the present and the past in order effectively not just to remember what happened, but to ensure that in moving forward that the peace process doesn't make any of the same mistakes that happened previously, and that the next generation is able to learn and appreciate just how far things have moved on.
And the former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern in that picture too, of course, was one of the two men who brokered the Good Friday Agreement alongside his British counterpart at the time, Tony Blair. I also interviewed Bertie Ahern recently to reflect on those 25 years, and he shared Tony Blair's view that perhaps there is a lack of leadership and a lack of understanding of the nuances of Northern Ireland these days. And you need to understand the nuances if you're going to resolve the difficulties that currently exist. But he said it was easy to analyse why. He said we knew that if we failed, it was going to go back to people dying on the streets. And although there is a threat still, it's not at that level. So there was a very clear motivation for them to get this over the line. But I have to say, Claire, sadly, I am old enough to remember the broadcast ban having been imposed by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. That decision does seem extreme. It was taken after the 1983 IRA bombing of the Grand Hotel in Brighton during the Tory party conference. And it was totally bizarre that in order to, I suppose, circumvent the broadcast ban that had been imposed, broadcasters hired an actor to voice the words of Gerry Adams. So the Sinn Féin view was still expressed, but in many ways...
Word for word.
Yes, and in many ways, as journalists, we would defend that, because that is not journalism expressing an opinion. It is ensuring that every voice is heard, that there is accuracy, that there is balance, that people have an opportunity to come to their own conclusions. But those were very, very dark days in the 1980s. And when the IRA took its bombing campaign to a new level, and not just in Northern Ireland, but across other parts of the United Kingdom as well.
Yes, and the bombing that you referenced at the hotel, that was the bombing in which Norman Tebbutt's wife was injured, wasn't it?
Yes, I think there were 5 people killed. The Prime Minister of the time, Margaret Thatcher herself, narrowly survived. She was working on her conference speech at 3 o'clock in the morning when the bomb went off, and she often talked about how the ceiling came down on her room, and so they came close to assassinating a British Prime Minister at that time. And the IRA's response to that bombing was that we've only got to be lucky once. That's how entrenched the opposition to British rule in Northern Ireland was. That's how convinced the IRA were, the Provisional IRA, that the way to resolve the issue, to have the British pull out of Ireland altogether, was through violence. They talked about the armed struggle. That's the term they used, a term that unionism doesn't like, of course. But it was a violent conflict that lasted for 30 years and resulted in 3,500 lives being lost, 50,000 people being injured. And for today's generation, that's difficult to comprehend. To put it in context, proportionally, that's greater than the number of people who were killed in the 9/11 attacks in the United States. And when you think about the fact that Northern Ireland has a population of 1.9 million people, you can understand why there are so many homes with an empty seat at the table. As President Biden himself said yesterday, there is hardly a family that wasn't touched to some degree or another by the 30 years of violence. And so Claire's right, we've come on a remarkable journey. Transformed Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement. Whether people agree with it or disagree with it, it's a completely... My children in their late teens and 20s have grown up in a completely different Northern Ireland to the one that I grew up in, where we lived every day with vehicle checkpoints, with being searched, going into shops, being unable to go socialising for a drink or to the cinema or wherever you wanted to go because of the fear it would be targeted by a bomb. And then once I found myself in the business of journalism, we lived on a relentless treadmill of bombings, shootings, funerals, reprisals, and it was just relentless. So when you reflect on that, we may have political difficulties right now, but we've overcome much greater ones before.
But living through all of that, how is the trauma of that time dealt with? Because the trauma must still exist now.
Yes, and people talk now in Northern Ireland about a generational trauma, and there's been a lot of research into this, where the areas of Northern Ireland where most violence was experienced are the areas of Northern Ireland where there appears to be the greatest problem in terms of mental illness. And some of the research is suggesting that some of the people who are experiencing that trauma were not even born at the time of the Good Friday, at the time of the Troubles. It was their parents, and that's why it's described as a generational trauma. And even that perhaps explains why there is still division, because that runs deep when there are people who feel so strongly about their unionism, their Britishness, and so strongly about their nationalism, their Irishness, and they pass that on to a new generation. And it's why America in particular has repeatedly called for integrated education, because we've still got, largely speaking, segregated education in Northern Ireland, and many people feel that is one of our problems, that we really need to move towards educating a new generation to take down the barriers, to take down the walls that still exist, both metaphorically and literally, in the city of Belfast.
Yes, fewer than 10% of schools in Northern Ireland are currently what's called integrated, so that's where religion isn't the basis of distinction between students. All students, regardless of faith or background, are educated together in those settings. But it's particularly poignant as well, just to reflect on the fact that I obviously come from an academic context, and I spent a few years teaching at Queen's University in Belfast. And it was not uncommon for